My name is Jonathan, and I never thought that my life would turn into such a nightmare. Elizabeth, my wife, has just given birth to our first child, little Jack, and we have come to her parents so that she can recover from a cesarean section. Elizabeth looked tired, but still beautiful. Her long brown hair, though a little disheveled, framed her face, and her green eyes shone despite her fatigue. We were standing in her parents' living room. The spacious, bright room was furnished with cozy furniture in a classic style. There were family photos on the walls, and the smell of fresh bread was in the air. I placed the last suitcase with Elizabeth's belongings and looked around. Michael, her father, a tall and sturdy man with graying hair and kind blue eyes, came up to me with a smile. "Jonathan, it's been hard, but I'm glad Elizabeth and Jack are here," I said, trying not to show my emotions. Michael nodded, his face radiating warmth and concern. His wife, Mary, a petite woman with short blonde hair and piercing brown eyes, was also here. She was carefully helping Elizabeth to settle into an armchair. "We're glad we can help," Michael replied, putting his hand on my shoulder. "It's hard to believe that you're already parents." Elizabeth smiled faintly. Her fatigue was obvious. She looked at me, and I felt a strange mixture of love and regret. She looked fragile and vulnerable, but there was still a spark in her eyes that always attracted me. "Dear, thank you for everything," Elizabeth said softly, her voice trembling with fatigue and emotion. "I do not know what I would have done without you." We were all glad that the birth was successful and we had a nice baby. A few days after I was discharged from Elizabeth's hospital, I learned the shocking news. I was sitting in the car in front of Elizabeth's parents' house, trying to collect my thoughts and gain strength for what I had to do. I was beside myself with rage. It's been 2 days since I found out about her cheating, and I couldn't put this moment off any longer. Then, summoning all my resolve, I got out of the car and headed for the door. Her father, Michael, and her mother, Mary, were in the living room. Michael was sitting on the couch, flipping through a newspaper, and Mary was knitting a sweater for the newborn Jack. Elizabeth, still weak from childbirth, was sitting in a chair by the window, her face pale and tired. "Jonathan, we were just talking about you." Michael greeted me with a smile. "How did it go at work?" I tried to smile back, but I could feel the anger boiling inside me. Mary looked at me with concern. "Jonathan, you look tired." I nodded, trying to control my emotions. "The time has come." I took a deep breath and said loudly, "Elizabeth, I need to talk to you and your parents." All eyes turned to me. Elizabeth looked worried, but she didn't say anything. Michael and Mary exchanged puzzled glances. "What happened, son?" Michael asked, folding the newspaper and sitting up straight. "Michael, do you remember what you said at our wedding when the priest asked who was giving this woman in marriage?" Everyone in the room turned their eyes to me. Elizabeth looked surprised, Mary looked worried, and Michael looked with a slight smile, remembering that moment. "Of course I remember, Jonathan. It was one of the proudest moments of my life." Michael replied, not understanding what I was getting at. I paused to collect my thoughts and said, "Well, I want her back." Michael and Mary's laughter died down when they realized I wasn't joking. Elizabeth looked at me in horror, not understanding what was happening. I took the phone out of my pocket and looked at it, feeling my heart beating in my chest. "I want you all to listen to this," I said, pressing the play button. The room was filled with voices. Elizabeth's voice sounded, "It was just a meeting, Dad. We were just having dinner." Elizabeth turned pale, her eyes widened in horror. Mary froze, her knitting fell out of her hands. "Jonathan, that was 10 months ago. It doesn't mean anything," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling. "Doesn't mean anything," I repeated bitterly. "Elizabeth, you dated an ex-lover shortly after our wedding. It means everything." I looked her straight in the eye, trying to keep calm, even though everything was boiling inside. "It wasn't just dinner, Elizabeth. And it's not just a mistake," I said, turning to the little cradle where Jack was sleeping. Everyone in the room understood what I meant. Michael frowned at his daughter. "Elizabeth, is this true?" Elizabeth nodded, tears starting to flow down her face. "It was just one time, Dad. I just wanted to say goodbye. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" I said, feeling my anger rise. "You lied to me, Elizabeth. And now I do not know who the father of our child is. Is Jack my son or is?" Mary screamed and pressed her hands to her lips, her eyes filled with horror. "Jonathan, you can't think like that," she exclaimed. "Jack is your son." "How can I know that?" I replied sharply. "Elizabeth betrayed me. I can't trust her." Michael got up from the couch, his face flushed with anger. "Jonathan, I understand your anger, but you can't accuse Elizabeth of such a serious matter without proof." I looked into his eyes, trying to hold back the tears. "Michael, I loved your daughter. I did everything to make our marriage happy. But now I do not know what to do." Elizabeth was sobbing, her body shaking with tears. She tried to stand up, but her weakness would not allow her to do so. "Jonathan, please forgive me," she said, her voice barely audible. "I made a mistake. But I love you and Jack." I couldn't look at her anymore. All my feelings were mixed up in a chaotic mass of pain, anger, and disappointment. "I can't live with this, Elizabeth," I said quietly. "I'm leaving. I do not know what will happen next, but I cannot stay here." I turned and headed for the door. Michael and Mary were left standing in shock, while Elizabeth continued to cry. When I went outside, I felt tears rolling down my cheeks. The week passed slowly. The pain in my heart did not subside, and every day only added new questions and doubts. I was living in a hotel, trying to find a foothold in this sea of pain and betrayal. But even away from home and family, there was a void inside me that nothing could fill. One of the hardest moments was the phone call from Michael. I knew it would happen sooner or later, but that didn't make it any less painful. I picked up the phone, not knowing what to say. "Jonathan, this is Michael." His voice came from the other end of the line. "I want to talk to you." "Hi, Michael," I replied, trying not to show my emotions. "We're all very worried about what happened," Michael began, his voice sounding tired. "But I think you should give Elizabeth a chance to explain herself." I held back a bitter smile. "Michael, I already know everything. I heard the recording, and I saw her face when the truth was exposed. There is no explanation that could change my feelings. Please, Jonathan, think again," Michael pleaded. "Elizabeth regrets her actions. She loves you and Jack." I fell silent, feeling the pain coming back again. I loved her too, Michael. But how can I trust her again? How can I be sure that she won't betray me anymore? Michael hesitated, not knowing what to say. "I understand, Jonathan, but I still hope that you can find a way to overcome this," Michael said. The conversation ended, but the painful thread of disappointment and destruction continued to pierce my soul. A week later, I received a letter from a lawyer. Elizabeth filed for divorce. It was like the last nail in the coffin of my happiness. I realized that this was the end. Our dreams of a family and a future have collapsed, leaving only ruins and ashes. I went back to our house to pick up my things. Looking at the empty walls and dusty corners only increased my pain. I collected everything that was mine, leaving the past behind. As I was leaving the house, I met Elizabeth's father, Michael. His eyes were filled with regret and longing. I couldn't look him in the eye. All my hopes and dreams had collapsed, and now I was standing in front of the ruins of what had once been my life. Elizabeth was sitting in Michael's car, crying, covering her face with her hands, and I looked at her one last time before walking out the door. I'll pick up the rest of my things later, I said quietly, feeling the last drops of hope leave my heart. It's been a few months since I left Elizabeth. The first weeks were painful. I woke up in a cold sweat, remembering her betrayal, and every morning I felt a weight on my soul. But over time, the pain began to subside, giving way to a determination to move on. I rented a small apartment on the other side of the city. It was a modest place, but it was a new beginning for me. Every evening I sat on the balcony with a cup of coffee and watched the sunset, thinking about the past and the future. My company was books, and sometimes muted music. One evening I received a message from an old friend, Mark. He was one of the few people who knew about my divorce and supported me in difficult moments. We haven't seen each other for several years, but his words were always sincere. "Jonathan, hi. How are you? Long time no see. Let's meet and talk. I know it's hard for you right now." I replied by arranging to meet on the weekend. On Saturday evening, we met at a cafe on the outskirts of the city. Mark looked the same as I remembered him, tall, with short hair and kind brown eyes. "Hi, Jonathan," he smiled, shaking my hand tightly. "How are you holding up?" "Hi, Mark," I replied, feeling the warmth of his friendship envelop me. "It was difficult, but I'm coping. Thanks for writing." We sat down at a table and ordered coffee. Mark listened attentively as I told him about the latest developments. "You know, Jonathan," he began when I finished, "I've always believed that something good can be learned from any difficult situation. It may sound corny, but it's true. You have a chance to start all over again, to find your happiness." I nodded, reflecting on his words. Mark always knew how to choose the right words. "You're right, Mark," I finally said. "I've been immersed in pain and disappointment for a long time, but it's time to move on. Maybe I can find my place in this world." We talked for a long time, remembering old times and dreaming about the future. That evening, for the first time, I felt light and hopeful. The next day, I decided to go for a run in the park. Fresh air and movement helped me clear my mind and feel alive. While running, I met Laura, the girl from the house next door. She was sweet and friendly, with short red hair and bright blue eyes. "Hi, Jonathan. I didn't expect to meet you here," she said with a smile. "Hi, Laura. I didn't expect it either," I replied, feeling her smile infect me. We ran together, talking about life and sharing stories. Laura told me about her job at the local library and how she loves to read books. "It always seemed to me that all the answers could be found in books," she said, looking at me with her penetrating eyes. "I love books too," I replied, feeling something special arise between us. Over time, our runs became regular. We started spending more time together, and I realized that being with Laura made me feel better. She was a bright ray in my life, and I thanked fate for our meeting. One evening, after another run, we were sitting on a park bench watching the sunset. Laura turned to me and said, "Jonathan, I know it's been hard for you, but I believe you can do it. You are a strong person, and you have everything to be happy." I looked at her and smiled, feeling her words sink into my heart. "Thank you, Laura," I said quietly. "You've helped me more than you think. I'm starting to believe that everything will be fine." She smiled, and at that moment I realized that a new path was opening up in front of me. The path where I can find happiness and love again. And although there were many unknowns ahead, I was ready to go forward, knowing that there were people next to me who were ready to support and help.